Welcome back, everybody, to What Really Matters. I'm Jeremy Stern with you in Los Angeles. I'm here, as always, with Walter Russell Mead of Tablet, the Wall Street Journal, Hudson Institute, and the Hamilton Center at the University of Florida. Let's start with this week's news. First story of the week. Donald Trump's tariffs policy has led to a market downturn, raising fears of an imminent recession. Goldman Sachs has spiked the probability of a recession hitting the United States in the next 12 months from 15 to 20%, according to the Wall Street Journal. In an interview with Fox News, Trump did not rule out the possibility of a recession, but made the case that the changes he's making to the economy could make a small recession worth it in the long run. There's a period of transition because what we're doing is very big, he said. We're bringing wealth back to America. During his first term, Trump often boasted about the strength of the stock market as a win and proof that investors approved of his performance. But this time, however, he seems willing to accept what he sees as short-term pain. Walter, news or faux news?
Well, it is. I mean, it's kind of fun to see Trump sort of trying to spin the economy as opposed to gloating about the economy. And I will say, just on a personal basis, as someone who's about to close on a mortgage in the next month, it would not break my heart to see a significant deceleration and a decline in long-term interest expectations. But I will say one thing. If Trump is going to have a recession, he needs to have it soon. Because what you want is 6 to 9 months of pain followed by a long recovery so that by the time the voters go to for the congressional midterms, they're back in a good mood. So you want to get the bad news out early and so on. But it is significant that when Trump has talked about recession tariffs in the past, he never sort of suggested that there was any suffering involved. It was all going to be great. Trade wars are fun. They're fast. They're easy. Everybody's going to be better off. It's a golden age. In none of this was there any recession talk. And that's the kind of thing that can make people wonder if you actually knew what you were doing. But the real question for me, Jeremy, is whether Trump is going to look at that falling stock market, though, by the end of this week, it was actually climbing back up, I think, largely because, step back here. All of the talk about tariffs causing the stock market to crash left out one little detail, which was we were also looking at a government shutdown at the end of the week, and the Republicans had a one-vote majority in the House. And so, interestingly, when the government shutdown began to fade out of the picture and Chuck Schumer said he was going to vote for the CR in the Senate, the stock market reversed, even though the tariff news was still there. So we should always remember that when people say the stock market fell because of X, there is no person called the stock market who has one opinion about one thing and that makes him go do something. It's millions of people all over the world with very different calculations, things going through their head. And so, I don't know how much I think there's a faux news quality to 85% of the financial market stuff that you hear. Just something to keep in mind. And there was clearly some here. But in any case, will Trump, if we get financial market problems connected with tariffs and we start seeing trouble in the real economy, inflation going up, shortages of goods at Walmarts, things like that, well, then then it'll be interesting. Is Trump someone who touches a hot stove, which he didn't think was hot, burns his finger, and then says, "Oh, I'm never doing that again"? Or is Trump like, say, Turkish President Erdogan, who deeply, deeply believes, I think he still probably deeply, deeply believes that high interest rates cause inflation. And so when you have inflation, the worst thing you should do is raise interest rates. In fact, you should try to cut interest rates when you have high inflation. Erdogan really believes that. And for a very long time, he kept trying this policy to make this policy work. Even though the Turkish currency was going down, the Turkish economy was having trouble, he kept at it and kept at it because he believed it. And so we're going to find out, I think, is how deep is Trump's faith, on the one hand, that tariffs can work economic miracles, and on the other hand, that he can spin bad economic news to keep his base loyal and supportive. And I think between those two beliefs, we'll see whether he's actually going to ride the economy down into a recession if the tariff problems continue, or if he's going to find some way to turn aside and say, it was all reciprocity, and guess what? I got some, and so for now we're all fine. We'll see.
It's the kind of economic theory or economic history question. Do you buy the kind of theory associated, I think, with Hayek and von Mises that recessions, although they're painful, are beneficial or necessary to correct market imbalances, especially after periods of large-scale government spending? Not that Hayek and Trump have quite the same types of imbalances in mind, but do you think that that's largely true throughout history, or no?
Well, we certainly since capitalism appears on the stage in its modern form, sort of beginning in the 17th century, you have a whole series of financial crises and real market recessions that are driven by financial and economic issues. In the past, before this, if the potato crop failed, the economy was in bad news. It was sort of a commodity economy, and it was related to sort of much more to natural events or possibly to a Mongol invasion cutting off vital trade routes or burning down your city or whatever else it might be. But this idea that that a problem can originate inside the economic system and then cause millions of people to lose their jobs or their homes and companies to crash and all that, that's a product of the market capitalist system. Marxists, of course, think that a series of escalating crises will sooner or later bring it to an end. I see a lot of our Marxist friends write about late capitalism, but so far we don't seem to have hit that crisis. Maybe the next one, who can say? But anyway, I think that there are different kinds of recessions. There are recessions that are the result of, you overspent or underregulated, things got out of control, like the sort of housing market in the first decade of this century. And then at some point, something snaps and it crashes, and then you start figuring out. Other times what happens is more that a market economy is not a steady state phenomenon. It evolves so that, you start, for example, in financial markets, people invent new kinds of securities. That was a problem with some of the collateralized debt obligations of the that helped to cause the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. And as that happens, the financial markets start working differently. And technology, we now have sort of AI-driven trading strategies, and AIs may be designing securities. Well, who knows? You get to a point where neither market participants nor market regulators actually understand how all of these things would interact under certain circumstances. And then some random event can occur that triggers something that no one expected. And when it comes, nobody knows how to deal with it. And then, the whole stack of dominoes, one after the other, the whole line of dominoes falls, and you have to deal with the aftermath. So, that's one kind of recession. And that's not so much a house cleaning recession. Oh, we done wrong. We sinned. We were too lax. We were too strict. It's actually, we succeeded. We pushed the economic system to do things it never did before, and we didn't understand it. And boom, it all fell apart. Now we understand it a little bit. We put the pieces together, and we go forward until we reach some new level that we don't understand, and bang, it goes down. So there are all kinds of dynamics. And I think as financial markets evolve, you get more dynamics at work, and the dynamics start interacting with each other. So I would argue, I think, that as human society develops, our understanding of economics is going to develop because the phenomena are changing. The financial markets of today are not the same thing as the financial markets of 1930 or 1910. So in that sense, yes, I'm going to say we learned something from recessions. There's a certain inevitability. I don't think we'll ever get away from recessions. And also, if we did, people would start behaving in really stupid ways, kind of like the Chinese in the years where, the Chinese economy is growing 10% a year. You cannot lose money very easily in an economy that's growing. You can be the worst banker in the world. You can be the stupid brother-in-law of the worst banker in the world, right? And it's very hard to find investments that lose money in that context where everything is growing. But should then growth goes from 10% to 6%, which most people would consider a great boom, suddenly you need at least a little slight bit of brain in there somewhere to keep from losing money. But you have a whole cadre, a whole generation of people that don't know how to do it. So recessions come, they're necessary. We need to learn from them, but I would never counsel a politician to bring on a recession in order to clean house. I think that's taking virtue a little too far.
All right, our second story. During his campaign, Trump vowed to, quote, reclaim our once great educational institutions from the radical left. Recent edicts from the president ordering colleges to end DEI programs or anything the administration deemed as discriminatory or else risk losing federal funding aim to begin the process. According to the Wall Street Journal, colleges are rolling back programs that they fear could run afoul of the administration's guidance and are making other changes. The University of Virginia voted last week to dissolve its DEI and Community Partnerships Office. The University of North Carolina will no longer mandate students take DEI-related classes to fulfill general education requirements. And Columbia pledged to work with the government to restore funding after the administration canceled roughly $400 billion in federal grants and contracts last week. Walter, news or faux news?
Well, news in that we are learning that colleges who sort of thought that you could take federal money forever and that this would have no bearing on your independence are suddenly discovering that becoming dependent on the government is a dangerous thing for a private institution, or for that matter, University of North Carolina is a public institution. But in that case, as a public institution, the idea that the university can operate sort of in defiance of the legislature or defiance of public opinion in your state is a stupid way to think. It's a stupid way to run your life. It doesn't mean, by the way, that I approve of governments going in and saying, okay, the federal government says that your Middle East curriculum should be X, Y, and Z. I don't like that. But the way to deal with that is that the private university, the department, needs to be responsible enough so that it knows, wait a minute, the curriculum is not the playground where I get to try to make all these kids absorb my favorite pet theories or take whatever academic fad, left, right, center, whatever, that's even less important, but whatever's fashionable now in my crowd. And we're just going to like sort of unthinkingly press this on kids. And aren't we so clever? No, you are accountable. A university, a college is accountable to the larger society. As a public school, you have one set of obligations, but even as a private institution where your endowment is not subject, people can give tax exempt money to you, your researchers get money from the government and so on, you are accountable. And so I'm afraid that what's happened is that we have a generation of academics, maybe two generations of academics, who believed that they floated above the rest of society and were absolutely autonomous in their sphere and did not have to think practically and sensibly about what it is that that society expects from the academy, and then figure out how to deliver that, or at least a minimum of that, without compromising what they see as the core elements of their independence and identity. And that, I think, is, that's on the universities. That's on mediocre college presidents. It's on mediocre faculties. It's on a lack of sort of statesmanship and vision, a lack of political reality. And now they're paying a price. I wish they weren't paying the price. I don't like the sort of the grand inquisitor. Again, I think of Ronald Reagan. I'm from the government and I'm here to help. Yeah, that person coming to the English department's front door. Uh, yeah, the English department may need some overhaul and some rethinking, but probably a bureaucrat from the federal government is not going to be the person who has it. So, what we're seeing is poor behavior and short-sighted behavior by university faculties and presidents over a long period of time has left them exposed and vulnerable. They're a bit like a baseball player who thought the pitcher would never, never look, and so kept taking longer and longer leads off base, and they went too far, and they're going to be thrown out. So, yes, it's news. It's not great news, even though some of the reforms that they're going to be putting are, I think, sensible reforms. What I really wish we'd see is universities acting thoughtfully and proactively to develop curriculums, develop understanding of key and controversial issues, understanding a little bit better their role at producing citizens, what that does and doesn't mean. I'll just, when I'm teaching my classes, I taught them at Bard and teaching now at University of Florida. What I tell my students, listen, my job here is not to help, push you into one political party or another. So the real two parties in America is there's a smart party and a stupid party. And the smart party has a left wing and a right wing, and the stupid party has a left wing and a right wing. I am much more concerned with whether my students are in the smart party than I am with whether they're in the right or the left wing of the party. That's your decision. But I'm going to try to get you into the smart party one way or another. I think that is a better way for universities to manage some of the issues that do come up in every classroom.
All right, final story of the week. Tanzania and Zambia, along a poster child for China's reach in Africa, are negotiating with a consortium led by the state-owned China Civil Engineering Construction Corporation for a $1 billion concession to rehabilitate and run the Mukololo Chanda, once known as Africa's Freedom Railway, but decayed and dilapidated in recent decades, reviving the strategic export route to Beijing. According to the Financial Times, the railway is an exemplar of a revamped, leaner approach to Chinese overseas development that comes just as President Trump's gutting of USAID throws Western approaches to foreign assistance into question. China has long taken a different path from Western nations, focusing less on humanitarian aid and more on financing grand infrastructure projects that many African leaders say are needed to lift their countries out of poverty. Walter, is this news or faux news?
Well, I think it is a sign of deep confusion at the Financial Times, because if I'm hearing that story correctly, they're saying on the one hand, oh, it's so terrible, USAID is burned down, and this is where it's going to leave the field free to China. But on the other hand, it's saying, and all along, China's had a smarter approach. The U.S. has done like soft power stuff. In other words, USAID, while China has done infrastructure projects. All right. This is just, I need a stick to beat Trump with. I want a stick. I want to beat Trump. I want to beat Trump. And here's my stick, and I'm going to beat him. And I do not care, right, what the stick is or whether it's coherent. There's a lot of that going around. And I think readers of the news, has nothing to do with whether you support Trump or loathe Trump. We all need to work to discipline our minds, because a lot of people, including people in the journalism business, suffer either from, like MAGA hypnosis and everything is golden and it's the golden age, or Trump derangement syndrome, and cannot look at any story on earth without finding some sort of anti-Trump angle to it. So the story does not give us the information you would need to evaluate whether, whether this is a smart move on China's part or a stupid move. The fact that the railroad has fallen into disuse over many decades is at least a small argument in favor of it's not being all that useful. It's kind of interesting that, the World Bank never seemed to think, of all the projects the World Bank was supporting and so on and so forth, this one seemed just didn't make that top 10 list. So again, a real story by a newspaper that was serious about covering things would actually help readers understand stuff like this. But this is sloganeering. And the answer is that the story does not provide us enough information to tell whether this is real news or faux news.
All right, that does it for this week's news. Let's have the big conversation. So this week, Walter, Vladimir Putin gave his initial response to President Trump's ceasefire terms in Ukraine, and it was a bit cryptic. He didn't reject the deal outright, but signaled that Russia would accept it only on a set of preconditions that would put enormous pressure on Trump domestically and would be clearly unacceptable to Zelensky and the Europeans. A couple days before Putin's public remarks, you more or less predicted this would be the case. You wrote, quote, Trump believes that improved relations with Russia are necessary for the American revival he hopes to lead, and he is willing to pay a high, even stupefying price in moral authority, alliance relations, and Ukrainian territory to get his deal. Vladimir Putin understands this and will charge the U.S. accordingly. You also noted that Trump follows Franklin Roosevelt and Richard Nixon in pursuing a kind of grand bargain with Moscow in realpolitik terms. Can you start by kind of talking us through the sort of history here of American attempts at these types of grand deals with Russia and what they might tell us about Trump's prospects?
A lot of Americans like to see American foreign policy kind of as a morality play. Are we helping the good guy? Who's the good guy overseas? Who's the bad guy? And then we judge American foreign policy by whether we're helping the good guys or the bad guys. And we're helping the good guys enough. All right, all of that stuff. And that's the filter a lot of people look through the Ukraine war in. And I would, if you're asking me what do I think about this, I'm pretty clear that this is Russia's fault. It's a war of aggression. Ukrainians want to live as an independent country, and Russia didn't invade Ukraine because it thought it was failing to ensure its independence from Russia. It invaded Ukraine because it was afraid it was succeeding. So on all of those points, and also in terms of the conduct of the war and the things that have been done during the war, my sympathies are with Ukraine. Just the way it is, and I've been to Ukraine twice in the war, and you see what you see. U.S. policy, however, is, you have to think about that a little bit differently. And one of the things that I note when I look back over the course of history is that when the U.S. is in a tight spot, we think less about morality and more about pragmatism. So the thing about World War II and Franklin Roosevelt's deal with Stalin in World War II is we needed the Red Army to keep losing millions of casualties so that we had a chance of beating Germany in the West. That's just the reality of it. And there was no alternative. It was either help Stalin survive the war and therefore inescapably be a great power after the war, or lose the war to Hitler, which would not have been a good idea. And so in that sense, the entire Cold War was blowback from World War II, in the sense that people use that term. I think it was a bargain that had to be made and was worth making. In the same way, the Nixon policy, at the end, the Vietnam War is going on. The U.S. is no longer able, we're so divided at home. We're weak. Bretton Woods is collapsing. The Soviet Union has reached parity on strategic nuclear weapons. We'd had a lead before then. So we'd gotten ourselves into a place where there just was no, we needed to have détente with Brezhnev. And so a lot of people, both when Roosevelt went to Yalta and when Nixon proposed détente to Brezhnev, a lot of people said, this is so immoral. You are consigning, in the Yalta case, all these millions of people to communism. He's going to do ethnic cleansing. He's doing terrible things. They were right. And in the same way at Brezhnev, what about human rights? Nixon, you're so amoral in realpolitik. What about human rights? And they played the violin beautifully. Okay. Fair enough. But the reason that we had to do these was because we had made stupid decisions before. So if we had sided with Britain and France and encouraged them to stand against Hitler in the 1930s, there would have been no World War II and no need for Yalta. And if we hadn't behaved so stupidly in Indochina, and if Kennedy and Johnson hadn't been misled by these visionary dreams of remaking the world and stuff, we wouldn't have been in the hole that made Nixon feel he needed to go to Brezhnev. And so after détente, and the U.S. begins to recover our international position, then we get both Carter and Reagan putting human rights back into American foreign policy. My point is that our ability to pursue a human rights course depends on our mastery of realpolitik, not the other way around. Okay? The iron fist benefits from a velvet glove, but the velvet glove is a useless rag without an iron fist. I'm not saying that human rights don't have a place in foreign policy. I'm saying if your foreign policy is not grounded in the realities of power, then you will lose the ability to do anything positive about human rights. Now, the question now, and it's an open question, I think, intellectually, is America's situation so dire now in the world that Trump needs to do what Nixon and Roosevelt did? Is Russia so strong and we are so weak? Or alternatively, is our country, is our public opinion so divided and torn that we have no alternative but to reach some kind of amoral settlement with Russia at whatever price we can get for it? And some people will say yes, and Trump is doing a necessary thing. And some people will say no, he is monstrously sacrificing Ukraine when he doesn't need to. And these questions it's rare that you can make a clear decision, or at least on this one you can't. I think at Yalta, in some ways, all right, we really do need Stalin not to make a second, not to make a peace agreement with Hitler that would leave us facing. We also would really like. Roosevelt wasn't sure that the atomic bomb was going to work, so he wanted to have the Soviets involved to declare war on Japan, which would again mean that a lot of Soviet soldiers would lose their lives in order to save the lives of a lot of American soldiers. Is that moral? Maybe it's a kind of a MAGA policy in a way. But Stalin would want a price for that. Now, then it turned out after Roosevelt died, the test worked and the atomic bomb worked, so that by the summer of 1945, we didn't really want the Soviet Union into the war with Japan, but too late. They honored their agreement. All of these things tell you that the relationship between making amoral deals on a realpolitik basis with a country whose views of morality and whose priorities are really not yours is a difficult thing. It's usually politically expensive because in the end you just get blamed. People blame you. They'll blame, suppose Trump is right and we actually have to make this deal, whatever it is. People will still say, a lot of people will just, again, another stick to hit Trump with, oh, he's so immoral, he's so weak, he appeases Putin when it wasn't necessary. Again, we can't be sure whether it's necessary or not. But you will tend to get blamed for it, just as Yalta was an incubus for the Democrats and détente was an incubus for Nixon. I think what we're seeing so far is that Putin clearly believes that he has an upper hand here. Or rather, even if he thinks he has a weak hand, suppose his economy is on the verge of collapse and so on, he feels he's successfully hidden that fact from Donald Trump. And so that whether or not he's winning the war, Trump thinks he's winning the war. And so he can push, push, push. And he thinks that Trump needs the deal more than he does. Again, or he thinks that Trump needs the deal more than Putin does. And when that's true, then you ask a very high price. So now we're going to go into a bargaining phase. One could, perhaps one outcome is that ultimately Trump will feel that Putin is playing him for a patsy and will turn on Putin. Or alternatively, he just is so convinced that this is the only option that he will give Putin 95% of what Putin wants. We just are going to have to watch and wait and see.
One final question. You also mentioned the effect that the failure of Trump's Russia policy, if that came to pass, would have on the MAGA movement at home. What do you think would happen in that event to the kind of credibility of the coalition that Trump's built, given that, Ukraine and Russia have been so salient there?
Well, what do you mean by failure? What is the circumstance that
For example, if Trump did give Putin 95% of what he asked for because he believes so strongly that the US did need to do anything to make the war stop, and then Putin didn't even honor the terms of that agreement and kind of embarrassed Trump or made it clear that Trump made a mistake?
if you give him 95% and he takes the other 5%, MAGA might not even notice. And their allies in this would be the liberal press that would be screaming so loudly about the 95%. You can't really turn it up to 11 if it's the 100%. I mean, we do know that historically, after the Munich Agreement in October 38, where Chamberlain agreed with Daladier and Hitler to divide Czechoslovakia, Hitler then broke that agreement in the spring of the next year and took more. And at that point, support for the appeasement policy in Britain collapsed. So you could see something like that happening. But Ukraine is it's such an emotional issue. And for the MAGA people, for some of them, it's become a real test of loyalty and vision. And not just loyalty to Trump, but are you a member of the blob who believes in the old, failed, endless wars, America as the liberal global policeman, punishing Uganda because it doesn't support trans rights?
Mm-hmm. Are you a neocon?
Right, right, exactly. Sort of that sort of thing. And when a complicated foreign policy question turns into a war of slogans, well, subtlety is not the chief outcome. But I do think that if it begins to look like Trump's support to Trump and then to Trump supporters that Trump isn't looking like a winner, that would be a very serious problem for the coalition.
All right, that does it for the big conversation. Let's end on the tip of the week. Another reader request this week, Walter. This one from Steve in Concord, who wants to know your favorite actor or actress, living or dead.
This is just gonna be so terrible because there's certain things you go through life and you realize you can't know everything. In fact, you can't know very much when you get right down to it. And so one of the things that somehow I either consciously or subconsciously decided when I was very young that I just would not follow is like the names of actors and actresses. I was once at my first newspaper column was the LA Times back in the 80s, I guess, and early 90s. And I was out visiting my editor in Los Angeles, and she was having a dinner party, and she knew a lot of, Los Angeles show business people. And and I came over early to help her like chop. We were chopping food in the kitchen and making dinner. And I knock at the door, and I said, "Well, I'll go get it." And I open the door, and there's this guy. He looks a little familiar, but I don't. And I say, "Hi," he said, "I'm Walter Mead." He said, "Hello." He said, "I'm Warren Beatty. I've wanted to meet you for a long time." Yes. And another time I was in a diner in New York and was alone reading a book about history of Spain. And this woman walking out the diner passed me. She stopped and said, "Hello, young man. This is a long time ago. What are you reading?" I said, "It's a book about Spain." She said, "Oh," she said, "I love Spain." And then she went on out. And after she left, the other people in the diner were like, and I said, they said, "Do you realize what just happened?" I said, "No." They said, "That was Patricia Neal." It's like I had no idea. So really getting tips on actors and actresses for me is, I guess maybe it would be historically dead David Garrick, just because I forget one of Samuel Johnson's friends said that David Garrick could make an audience laugh or weep by the varying stresses he pronounced on the word Mesopotamia. And that strikes me as kind of an acme of skill. But really, I'm Hollywood hopeless.
All right, there you have it. Thanks to our producer, Noam Bloom. Thanks to Will Cummings at Hudson and my co-host, Walter Russell Mead. I'm Jeremy Stern. We'll see you next week. And until then, please go rate and review us. This helps other people find the show.